We're live.
Yay, we're live. Woohoo.
Howdy, howdy.
Hello. And welcome to Midweek Mochas at the Owlery. At a slightly later time of day. Maybe we're more alert, maybe you're more alert. But still a tasty beverage. So, this week I was writing about putting on your oxygen mask first.
Yes.
And so, since this is a metaphor, let's set up the metaphor nicely. You are on an airplane. It's the day, so you can actually hear there's activity in the house. You're on an airplane. You get on, you stow your bags, you wait. And at some point, as the plane's getting ready to taxi to the runway, the flight attendants come out and give you the pre-flight check safety speech where they tell you things like, where the exit doors are in the event of a water landing and how to buckle your seatbelt. And they tell you that if the oxygen mask drops from the head of the cabin in the event of losing cabin pressure, you're supposed to put on your own first before assisting anyone else, particularly your children. And there's a good reason for this. Because if you go helping everyone around you, you're going to go passing out from lack of oxygen if you don't get yours on soon enough. And chances are, if you had to help someone put on an oxygen mask, they probably aren't capable of helping you. And I find this actually serves as a really good metaphor for life.
How so, Laura?
All right. So the reason that they tell you to do this, as opposed to it being particularly obvious, is that normally in a situation where you think someone's in danger, your instinct is to rescue first, if it's someone that you care about, and then deal with the danger.
Okay.
However, certain dangers don't work that way, like the oxygen situation, because fundamentally, you're more able to save the people around you if you take care of your own needs first. And I find that as a parent, there's actually a lot of situations that are far more like dealing with the plane losing cabin pressure than they are like, say, a tiger attacking you. That a lot of times what you have to do as a parent is take care of your own needs for things like food and rest before you can be as engaged with your kids, your students, as you need to be. And there's this risk that you put off things like adequate sleep or getting a shower or, eating at a reasonable time because kids matter and I need to get them this thing done and I can sleep when I'm dead. And that kind of attitude. There's this self-sacrificing attitude that ends up being self-destructive as opposed to selfless.
Yeah, I mean, it's not limited to parenting.
No.
I run into it all the time with colleagues at work and have going back 2 decades of life in the corporate world. So, I mean, yeah, it's an across-the-board problem. People not prioritizing their self-care, either physical, mental, spiritual, what have you. And they find themselves with nothing left to give. You end up burned out, you end up exhausted, you end up sick. You can either take time to take care of yourself or at some point your body will just rebel and not let you get any further, which to some degree is what happened to me a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
But so why don't you help our audience kind of dive into, you've set up the metaphor.
Yeah.
But let's get into some practical application, because at least in my observation and experience with our home education experiment, we've never had something that's as critical as a sudden loss of cabin pressure that would involve the deploying of the masks. But we have had a lot of more low-grade things where choices made and the way certain events were prioritized did result in some rather spectacular train wrecks.
Because fundamentally, it's, even if the leak of oxygen is a slow one, if you find yourself gradually having your resources depleted, at some point you are going to find yourself in a situation where you have nothing left to give. And it usually happens at the exact worst moment. So,
well, yeah, that's Murphy's Law, though.
Yeah,
I mean,
of course.
Everything that can go wrong will go wrong at the worst possible moment.
Yes. So the way I think about this is that what are sort of your sources of oxygen? And like I said, the first one I think of is sleep. I'm horrible about this, by the way. I do
Yes,
not
you
allow
are.
myself adequate sleep, and part of the
No, you
problem
don't.
is a circadian rhythm thing. I am a night owl. Like my whole life, I have been a night owl, and it was normal when I was a teenager to go to bed at midnight or beyond. Especially
Like all of our children do.
yes, most of our children, not all. We have one child who is not a night owl.
Okay, that's true.
And he is the one who usually greets us at 6 in the morning.
But he's usually up by 4:30 or 5.
Yes. So, but most of our children are night owls. And the problem is that if you decide that you are somehow obligated to keep a circadian rhythm like a normal diurnal person, when everything about you says my natural wake up time is 9 a.m. and my natural bedtime is 11:30, which by the way 11:30 to 9 a.m. is actually a really good block of sleep. But if that's where you're
so long as you don't have to be on conference calls with Team India or anything else along those lines.
And then that's true.
Hey guys, keep the running and gunning down. We're on a live stream.
So
Nerf war in the back hallway.
Yes.
At least they're not playing Quidditch.
At least they're not playing Quidditch. Nerf doesn't put holes in the wall quite
not as
badly.
easily.
Yeah. So what I found with the whole circadian rhythm thing is that since I don't have conference calls with Team India, there isn't a necessity for being up at an early hour from a school perspective. Nothing says you have to school between the hours of 7 and 3 p.m. And there's no reason why it can't happen at different hours. And if your household would be happier running on that frame, you're going to be taking oxygen away from the room if you're forcing yourself into a circadian rhythm that doesn't match yours or doesn't match your kids.
Well, let's make a distinction here. I mean, the circadian rhythm is the rhythm that your body's going to operate on.
Yeah.
Forcing yourself onto a schedule that differs from that
yes.
is where you create a problem.
Yeah. And so if you're a night owl, if your kids are also night owls, and if there is no other compelling reason to be up with the early birds, then move your schedule forward so that it's working with that. And then you're not going to have as much oxygen being drawn out, as much energy being taken away by trying to work on a schedule that doesn't match your circadian rhythm. And that
goes not just for the daily schedule, but the weekly, the monthly, the semester schedule. An acquaintance of ours is a school teacher. We have several acquaintances who are school teachers. Yeah. And he was asking me the other day, their last day of school, their institutional school, and a lot of the others in this area, their last day of school is this coming Friday. And he was asking me, do we actually take a summer break or whatever? Ooh. And I said, not really. We'll take we take a fairly substantial break off around Easter, and we take another pretty substantial break around Christmas. If we fall ill in midwinter, if we take a trip, even when we took a trip, our trip last fall, we did some school while on the trip.
I mean, as we pointed out with our episode a couple of weeks ago, the school classes didn't stop because we were on the road. And the same thing last fall. We have
some other acquaintances who sold their house, bought a boat, and are now sailing the world. And they just brought their homeschooling with them. And so they'll do schooling while they're on passage because there's really nothing else to do. You've got no internet. You've got no really contact with most other people while you're crossing open ocean.
So you can play the guitar and read books, basically.
Yeah, and work their way through the combination of online classes and book work that they bring with them on the boat.
Yeah, and so we're not required to keep our schedule matching the local one.
Even if you are required to attest to following that schedule, you can work around it.
Yeah.
Most of the states where they want you to have a certain number of hours and it has to be between day X and day Y. Well, what are you doing on Saturday mornings? What are you doing on Sunday afternoons? Is there additional time you have available that the institutional school is closed, but you can still make those hour requirements so that you have the flexibility that you desire?
Yeah.
Don't let the institutional bureaucratic crap control how you do what's best for you and your family.
And that's one of those places where you lose energy if you're forcing yourself onto a schedule that there's no reason to be forced onto it.
Right.
Now, there might be a reason. Let's say you end up with one of your kids is an early bird and you're not an early bird. Well, that's where the next thing that you do, that putting on your oxygen mask first, is setting up some kind of boundary, which is to say, okay, here's where you're going to find your breakfast. And here are the things that you can do school-wise that don't involve me at all.
When I was a kid, I would get up early Saturday morning, watch Saturday morning cartoons. I mean, that was just an 80s ritual.
Yeah.
My parents didn't want me to wake them up at 7 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday morning.
Certainly not for Smurfs.
Well, yeah, and there was like there was a good sequence.
Oh, yeah.
Really good cartoons.
Yeah.
They got me a little Return of the Jedi themed bowl. And on like Friday nights, my mom would fill it with, cereal and put some saran wrap over it to keep the roaches out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And, she'd put a little container of milk poured off so I didn't have to handle the big jug because I was still fairly small. And, I'd get up Saturday morning, I'd make my cereal, I'd watch my cartoons, and somewhere around, 10 or 11, I would have a headache from watching too much television. And my parents would finally be up and like ready to actually start the day and stuff. And so you can do the same thing. I'm not recommending, please, I want to be clear, I'm not recommending you feed your children cereal or anything along those lines. What I am suggesting, though, is if you do some preparation work, there are times where you aren't necessarily actively instructing, where even the youngest of children is still capable of doing things.
Yeah, and there's things like, all right, if you've got a reader, you've got a stack of things that they might need to be reading in preparation for, here's a book that
recommended reading, poetry recitation. A bunch of our kids will do handwriting. They'll get up and do handwriting, whether we're awake or not.
There's a lot of mathematics workbooks where, if they want to work through extra
a workbook
problems,
or a worksheet, and then you can grade it when you get up. Our kids, the grammar series we use, our kids can do grammar in the morning. And then, if Laura's got to go out that day, they can bring it to me. I can check it in between calls.
But the thing is that regardless, you can make a way to work around and say, okay, it's important for me that I sleep till this point to be sane. I have these children that are not going to sleep in until that point. So here's how I make sure that they're taken care of while I'm still taking care of me.
Right.
And that's one of those things that you have to look at. It's like, what do I need to care for myself? What do I need to care for those around me? And work out and test until you find the thing that is going to make that situation work better.
Right.
Do you need to have a shower in the morning to feel wakeful? Then schedule
you need to have a bath in the evening to relax so that you can sleep well.
Yeah. Make sure those are in your schedule and protect those, because those are part of what leave you not resenting the people around you. And that's the important thing, is that caring for yourself is not self-indulgence. It's taking care of you, because you are the responsible adult in the room and you're the one who has to take care of everyone, yourself included. So just as you make sure that your kids are getting the things that make sure that they are healthy and happy and well cared for, you have to do that for yourself as well. And you have to protect that.
Children learn best by imitation.
Yes.
So if you don't take care of yourself, you are teaching them not to take care of themselves. You can tell them to eat right, exercise, get adequate sleep, get at least 15 minutes a day of sunlight, whatever your list of best health practices is. You can lecture about that till you're blue in the face. They're not going to do the things that you don't do. They will do the things that you do. So part of self-care is setting a good example, recognizing that for the youngest children, they're going to imitate that, and that's going to become their baseline expectation, their unconscious expectation of what a healthy, loving adult, relationship with an adult is. As they get older and they're going to start experimenting with self-identity and self-assertion, they're going to push boundaries, but that's where habituation is very, very helpful. If you aren't habituating yourself, and by example, your children, to good habits, then you're habituating them to bad habits. Habits aren't neutral.
No. And habits, good or bad, are the rails that you run on.
Mm-hmm.
And so once you do something a certain way, typically, that's how you're going to keep on doing it until you exert a lot of effort to change it.
Yeah.
And so that's one of those reasons why you want to make sure that if you found that there's a habit that makes you sane, you need to make sure that you keep on it and protect it. And that's the other thing I found is that with my kids, they'll like swamp me. It's like, Mom, can you please do this now? It's like, we will do it at this time. Not no, just this is when we will do it. And that way they know that you are going to be present to give the spelling test or read through the thing that needs grading, but that it's important that Mom gets her cup of coffee and her breakfast.
And that things that can't be done simultaneously will be done in sequence.
Yes.
And to be clear, this is a challenge I have with my clients at work. This is a challenge I have with coworkers at work.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff has very broad life application.
Yeah, I mean, because people are people,
Yeah.
whether they're adults or they're kids, they want to be listened to. They want attention. They have legitimate needs.
Yeah.
Sometimes they don't have an adequate sense of priorities or what the time and energy demands are. I had a client recently asking, well, when can we do a thing? And I said, I'm not prepared to commit to a time estimate because I don't yet have a way of evaluating how much work is involved. I need you to be able to answer these questions for me. And I need you to put that in writing so that we can document it. And then from there, we can evaluate what the work effort's going to be. Sometimes you have to do that with your kids. I know I have to do that with my kids. I presume you probably have to do that with your kids where you're like, okay, let's take a step back, deep breath. All right, you need X, Y, and Z done. What's most important to least important? Let's rank that. And then about how long is each of these things going to take? And sometimes the most efficient thing you can do is take 15 minutes to do some planning rather than just jump in and keep trying to do thing after thing after thing after thing, which is something that I know you absolutely struggle with.
Yes. And that's one of those things. It's like, as I'm doing this, some of this is preaching to myself, because I can step back and I can say, this is something that I need to do. Not necessarily something that I do all the time. But that's really where it comes to. It's like protecting time and being able to step back and take the time to actually assess what something is, because what runs you down is just diving in without any sense of how much energy do you have,
Right.
how much time do you have. And then if you dive into a project or a thing and then you find it's overrunning the time that you needed to cook lunch, or it's overrunning the time that you needed to be something, and now it's only half finished and everyone's upset and you're upset and you're resenting the kids and it all spirals. It could have all been stopped if at the beginning you're like, all right, let's figure out if we've even got time to do this right now. If not, what's the earliest time that we can do it so that it gets done?
And again, some of that goes back to planning and priorities, which again goes back to self-care. What are the routines and habits you need to cultivate so that you are functional as an adult and can more or less remain calm in the situation and help model adapting, adjusting, and overcoming obstacles for your children.
As well as modeling what are the things that give you energy and making sure that you have time for them.
Yes.
Because if you recognize, it's not just things like Mommy needs her coffee. It's things like, I've stopped feeling sane if I don't allocate a little bit of time each week to spend time on reading. For some people, it's hobbies, and that
you're journaling. Your journaling
Yes.
is one of those non-negotiables that
Yeah.
you routine. That's the first. Journaling and doing your scheduling in your journal is the first thing you throw out when you start feeling pressed for time. And it's the one thing that keeps things running smoothly when you make the time to do that.
Yeah. And
so let this be a lesson to you.
Yeah.
Stop neglecting your journal.
Don't toss out something because it feels like you don't have time. If that something is what allows you to actually have time in the first place, because it keeps you sane and on track. I mean, for some people, it's their morning run. And I know a couple of people where if they neglect their exercise routine, everything else falls apart.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to figure out what are the things that are your...
Not that person.
No, me neither, unfortunately. But I do know, but we definitely do have friends who that is their thing. And that's part of their oxygen, part of what keeps them sane. And if they suddenly decide they're too busy to do it, everything else starts crumbling.
And how quickly it crumbles really depends on kind of a whole number of factors that influence kind of how strong and stable a life you've created.
So something that struck me as we were talking about modeling for your kids through those self-care routines, their own self-care, another aspect of it is things like I said, hobbies and reading, that not throwing those out is, I think, really important, especially for, it's really easy if you're in the stage where you still got little children to just believe you don't have time for whatever.
And in some cases you may not.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're talking nursing infants, we're talking newborns, we're talking toddlers, special needs children of any age, depending on what their particular situation is. There are legitimate,
there are seasons,
and there are legitimate circumstances where you may really not have the time. There are also plenty of situations where we've created the busy because it makes us feel important. It feeds the ego, no matter how exhausted and miserable it leaves us. And it's that unintentionally voluntary busyness that I'm at least I'm trying to address in my own life, and both professionally and personally.
But what I found is that while I have not been able to get back to a lot of the sewing that I used to do pre-children, and that's
true.
And some of that is like, it made a lot of sense when I had very little children. If you've got a nursing infant in arms all the time, playing with sharp needles is not the best idea. Just, I mean, really, yeah.
Really? Oh, okay.
So,
okay.
And so there, I love embroidery, but it's not something that I could do most of the times when I had the very small children. And we had them stair-stepped in such a way that I always had someone in arms.
Once the youngest got to an age where you could, it wasn't something you found you didn't enjoy it when you tried to pick it back up.
Yeah. And I think I found it was stressful. But what I did find recently is that I have been neglecting personal development reading for way too long.
Yeah.
And that's one of those ones where, as a parent, particularly a parent who is teaching, that's hugely important. One, because if you are trying to model for your children the importance of a life filled with good books, you ought to be reading on your own, not just reading to your children, because that suggests that this is something that you genuinely think is important, not that it's a kind of eat your vegetables situation.
Right.
So I realized,
and actually one of the great benefits of home education in general, and I want to stress this point because it's something you can do whether your kids are in an institutional school or not, almost regardless of family situation. You can commit to 5 minutes, 10 minutes a day of just reading aloud to your kids.
Yeah.
I'm certain there are some situations where that may prove impossible. But as a general rule, barring a few really outlier circumstances, most people can find 5 to 10 minutes to read something to their kids. And in a lot of cases, because of how little most of our parents read to our generation and the kids and folks who are younger than us who are now having children, they're all generations that didn't read a lot of the books that we read growing up. And so start rereading those books. Once you get to a point where your children are doing reading and you may be still doing read alouds to them of stuff that's maybe a little beyond them, or y'all listen collectively to an audio book or whatever. I think we touched on some of those strategies in one of our talks a couple of weeks ago. You should be reading as well. If you want to read self-improvement books, read self-improvement books. You want to read biographies, read biographies. You want to read fiction, read fiction. Read something that interests you, not because you feel you ought to read it.
Yeah, and it's more the making time to continue to learn, to grow, to relax and enjoy. It's like some books I read, it's purely recreation, but it's really nice to go back to a beloved favorite.
Yeah,
and it's like, wow, I remember I really loved this book. And it really is as good as I remember. Sometimes I don't have that experience, but frequently I do.
Yeah, there was a series I remember enjoying as a teenager, and I picked it up a few years ago, and it was One, I wanted to revisit it because it had been, I don't know, 20 odd years, almost 30 years since I had read it. But at the same time, I was like, let me reread this and see if, the content is appropriate for one of the kids who was coming to an age about equivalent to what I was when I read that book. And it was awful. The book was poorly written. It was just terrible. And
when you devour the entire sci-fi fantasy section of the library, you go back.
You can get your hands on. There's a lot you go back and you're like, how did I read this? No, why did I ever think this was good? So we'll omit the names to protect the guilty.
Hindsight is 20/20. But
I've read a lot of things over the intervening 30 years that helped cultivate my literary tastes in a very different direction.
It definitely does change what you enjoy.
Yeah.
But there are novels I've gone back and read. There's new novels that I've read either because I was pre-reading for a child or I got a recommendation. It sounded interesting. And then there's other things where it's more like I knew a woman, she ended up teaching herself Latin so that she could teach her kids Latin.
Yeah.
And so it started with her own allocating time. And yes, it was taking care of herself and doing personal schooling. But down the road, that time and she invested in her own education paid off because she was then able to pass that on to her kids.
And the neuroscience on that sort of thing is fascinating. The way the brain will build new neural connections, and it really does keep the brain young and flexible when you don't let it settle into patterns of boredom.
If you keep teaching it tricks, the dog doesn't get old.
Yeah, basically. That does seem to be one of the take-home lessons from neurological studies.
That fundamentally the brain stays fairly flexible if you keep on throwing stuff at it.
Yeah.
And that is fascinating. And that's a reason why you want to keep on learning things because you're setting a pattern for your kids.
And it's not just reading, although reading can be a very time efficient and for many people a relaxing way of doing that. We try and work a crossword puzzle daily over our morning coffee.
And
that's like a daily date.
Yeah.
Now it doesn't happen every day. I think last week we actually we had like 2 weeks of crossword puzzles backed up and it's like, okay, we're not going to get caught up.
But we could feel it.
Yeah.
We could feel it. And that's the thing. It's oxygen.
Yeah.
It's one of those places where that's one of our sources of energy for our relationship and for both of our own personal sanity. That if we start carving out of the day those things that help keep our brains exercised and keep us engaged and thinking, we become less focused. We become less able to deal with all of the other stuff getting thrown at us.
We were doing yoga together for a while last fall, and it was challenging, but it was good for the two of us to do. We need to get back to it. We got sick over the holidays back at the end of the year.
Yeah, you ended
and now we're 6 months into 2022 and haven't gotten started again. I know the weeks where I get to Taekwondo consistently, especially the weeks where I'm healthy enough that I'm sparring, that makes a huge difference in my energy levels, my sense of well-being. So
and the place where it is like, what on earth does this have to do with teaching kids? And it's everything, because it comes down to if you are feeling rushed, if you are feeling stressed, if you are feeling like you're running on empty, it's a lot harder to answer the questions and be attentive to your students in a way where you feel like you're on top of everything, particularly since, unlike, if you're a third grade teacher, after about 3 years, there's about a 3-year ramp up time from every teacher I've taught, that if you're teaching us a particular grade level in class, after about 3 years, you've almost got rails you can run on. You have to make adjustments. You have to get to know each batch of new kids. But at that point, you know the material. Well, when you're teaching at home, you're almost always dealing with new material. You never have that point where you can 100% run on autopilot.
No.
And so you need to be very, very attentive
and expecting that you can get to that point is an unreasonable expectation that you need to evaluate why. And again, like I was having a conversation with some coworkers recently, and it was like, well, a client wants to do XYZ. Well, why does the client want to do XYZ? Well, nobody can answer that question. I'm not even sure the client can answer that question. I don't have a problem with us trying to facilitate the client doing XYZ. But if the client doesn't understand why we're trying to do it, and we don't understand what we're trying to do, how do we know if we get it right?
Yeah.
So again, you have to do some of that same analysis on your schooling choices, on your recreational choices. And again, it'll come back to what's your end goal? What priorities do you have in order to achieve that end goal? What rails are you running on? What constraints exist? And then how do you go forth and do it? But I think we've said before, I don't think home education in our house has looked the same 6 months for any continuous 3 to 6 month period over the last 18 years.
No.
Like it just we are constantly adapting.
And some of it is you've been working in software for the last decade. And one of the things you learned from that is that you iterate. You test something. If it doesn't work, you make adjustments and you keep on doing that. You don't just say, well, it should work, so I'll keep doing that again. One of the benefits of that is that it's created a habit where as you encounter an issue, you can look and step back and say, okay, what's the problem? And the problem may be, why am I feeling run ragged? Well, I haven't allowed myself the time that I need to be on top of my schedule, check my journal, and make sure I know what I'm trying to achieve for the day so that I can say, yes, we can do these things. We're going to have to go ahead and set that thing aside,
right,
with the knowledge that that's in fact what the status is, as opposed to I feel like there isn't time because I don't know how much time there is.
Right.
And discovering that as an element is really helpful because it's helped me over the last couple of years start to pick out where are my sources of oxygen that I have to make sure I've got? What is my oxygen mask? How am I making sure that I'm taking care of my energy levels so that I'm present and available? And as you've pointed out, my journal is one of them. If I keep up with it, things run pretty smoothly. And it's not even just things are scheduled. It's more, I am aware of what we're trying to do.
Right.
And I know where, something as simple as we have an engagement this evening, so we need to make sure that we've got our dinner planned in light of that.
Yeah, we would have to reverse engineer. If we have to be at a certain location by, 6:45 p.m. local time, and it takes an hour to get there, we've got to be wheels up by 5:30, 5:45. So backing up from there, we've got to be done with dinner by 5. So we need to have dinner pretty much on the table by 4:15, which may mean we don't do lunch late in the afternoon. If lunch isn't done by 11, we just kind of, all right, have a larger snack or something like that.
And all of that affects it so that if I've thought through that whole day from the beginning, in the morning, if a child asks me, what's expected of me today, I can say,
right,
this is the time frame that we have available for schoolwork. So these are the things that are most important.
Mm-hmm.
If you knock all of those out, this is your stretch goal. And my ability to say that and not look like I'm pulling my hair out when I do it starts with knowing what are the things that I have to have taken care of before I can be present and available and not running on empty.
Which sounds like a good place to end this. I feel like we've beaten this horse into glue.
Probably so. So with that, thank you for listening. And in the show notes is all the places where you can find us on social media. And
question for all of you, what examples do you have of, what are the habits that keep you going? What are the obstacles you have to either developing those or modeling them appropriately? Let us know in the comments or by email. We absolutely love viewer engagement and feedback and look forward to talking to y'all again.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. It's right there.
I know where it is. The mouse is hypersensitive.
Yes, it is.